joining us to discuss difficult heritage. We have two fantastic speakers today to discuss this topic. I'm going to start by introducing both of them. Joining us from Jerusalem is Daniel Seidemann. He's a Jerusalem-based attorney and the director of Terrestrial Jerusalem. He is the preeminent expert on Jerusalem, the holy city, the contested holy city, and I think he's going to add a fantastic perspective to this discussion. Joining him is Kalliopi Amygdalou, an assistant professor of architecture at the National Technical University of Athens. She's also a senior research fellow at ELIAMEP, and I think she's going to help us understand what difficult heritage is and how we process it and its history. So the first question that I want to start with is actually to Kalliopi, and maybe you could just help us define what is difficult heritage to give listeners kind of a base as we go into our conversation.
Thank you, Sean. First, we should perhaps explain that heritage, we should think of heritage as an accumulated body of buildings, artifacts, and practices that have been curated over generations, right? Like every generation having agency in accepting it or redefining it. And heritage is something that allows us to identify a distinctive history, our distinctive history, and to affirm our identity. And buildings are very good at this. So because we're going to talk a lot about physical sites here, buildings and physical sites are very good because they are tangible, they're in public space, they're visible all the time, whether we want it or not. They intrude into our lives. And that is why the built environment has, since time immemorial, been an arena where different groups have competed in projecting their identities and in deleting the identities of others. Demolitions, excavations, how deep you dig, as we were talking earlier, reconstructions, constructions of new monuments are all practices of identity curation in space. But the thing is that usually heritage is, and for that very reason, selective and self-affirmative. It makes us feel good about ourselves, and it has to do with our cultural or military achievements. And this is where difficult heritage comes in to suggest a different way of engaging with our past. Now, difficult heritage has been defined as a past which we do acknowledge as meaningful, but at the same time is disturbing and awkward and unsettling. It usually has to do with dealing with the legacy of perpetrating atrocity. So prisons, mass murder sites, museums that present the history of colonialism, of slavery, of the Holocaust. These are types of difficult heritage. And what happens there is that the visitor comes face to face with the darkest part of their history. And this is a heritage which is there to induce self-reflection rather than celebration, right? And it triggers humility rather than pride. So it's a counter memorial, it's a counter heritage in a way. And there are two particular things that, let me give some examples, by the way. Apart from the Nazi concentration camps, which are a very obvious group of difficult heritage sites, there are all over the world, there is no single country that can claim that they don't have latent difficult heritage. Massacre sites from the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, the International Slavery Museum in Virginia, the Slavery Museum in Liverpool. We have apartheid sites in South Africa. Like it's all over the place. The Gulag Museum in Russia. So some of these sites are World Heritage sites right now. Like Auschwitz became a World Heritage Site in 1979, and Hiroshima Dome became a heritage site in 1996. So they're all over the place. And there are two things that, in my view, make this heritage particularly difficult. One is that, as I said before, our darkest side is exposed and open to criticism. If you think about it, there are only two roles that you can identify with when you are in those sites. You're either with the victim or with the perpetrator. So this site either triggers empathy for the victims, or you sense the crushing responsibility of the perpetrator. So this is a site where the function of the site is educational in the sense that it It evokes self-reflection and humility, and it's educational also in a moral way, not just intellectually stimulating, if you like. Yeah. And then the second, and I will close with this, the second element that makes this heritage so difficult is that it keeps the wound fresh for a larger good. So it does not allow closure. It acknowledges that violence does not belong safely in the past, but it's something ongoing and that it's still present in the present. And it also makes you acknowledge the suffering of the other side.
That's a great overview. And I mean, you mentioned the Holocaust sites in Europe, the nuclear bomb sites in Japan. I think we're very lucky to have Daniel here because he lives in a city where you can't not but face difficult heritage just walking out your door. Mm-hmm. Daniel, if you applied difficult heritage to the holy city of Jerusalem, can you discuss kind of the sites that are the most contested in this city and how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is a living, breathing conflict we all know about, revolves around these difficult heritage sites that Kalliopi spelled out so well?
Well, Jerusalem is kind of a laboratory for difficult heritage. It plays out all of the elements which you've described. I'd like to walk through the recent history of difficult heritage in Jerusalem. I'll start in 1967. You know, Jerusalem was a divided city between 1949 and 1967. The old city where the holy sites are were under Jordanian control and inaccessible to Israelis and Jews. And Palestinians, 20,000 of whom had been displaced from Jerusalem in 1948, also had their yearnings. In 1967, the reunification of Jerusalem came as a surprise, and I'm using the term reunification gingerly. We were surprised to find ourselves in control, Israel, of both East and West Jerusalem. On the first 2 days of the war, there was a debate in the Israeli cabinet. Should we or should we not take the old city of Jerusalem? Now, we had already taken the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Do we take the old city? And remarkably, there was a good deal of opposition within the Israeli cabinet to take the old city. And the opposition, ironically, came from the ultra-Orthodox and from the national religious, who today are the right-wing nationalistic flanks of the government. They did not want Jews to assume responsibility for the heritages of Christians and Muslims. They were very apprehensive of that. It's not good for the Jews to do something like that. In addition, Israel's legendary Minister of Defense, Moshe Dayan, also opposed it. He went up to Mount Scopus and looked out over the holy sites of Al-Aqsa, the Temple Mount, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and muttered, "Who the hell needs these Vaticans?" Well, they were overruled. And the following day, Israeli paratroopers took the old city, and 10 in the morning, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Dayan arrives at Al-Aqsa, the Temple Mount, and he sees Israeli flags flying from the mosques in Al-Aqsa and on the Mount. And he barked, "Take them down and never put them up again. We do not need a holy war." That was the birth of what has come to be known the status quo, that Israel will not aggressively impose our heritage over Muslim heritage. But that was only part of it. 2 minutes later, he went on camera and he said, "The Jewish people have returned to our most sacred sites, never to take leave of them again." This was the guy who 24 hours earlier didn't want to take them out, and here he is waxing eloquent about the biblical significance of the restoration of Jewish heritage. What a difference a day makes. Okay? It's an indication that even in the heat of battle in 1967, the significance of this war was being transformed from a war of self-defense into a war of biblical salvation and salvation of heritage. I'm doing this telegraphically, so I'm going to fast forward. The status quo that was established meant Al-Aqsa, Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif will be exclusively a place of worship for Muslims, and non-Muslims can only visit there. That was challenged from the very beginning by a fringe who aspired to basically see the State of Israel as a continuation of the heritage of ancient Israel, and Israeli control over the Temple Mount was the linchpin of that restoration. What began as a lunatic fringe became more and more mainstream. Fast forward, 2000, Camp David. At Camp David, the issue of what to be done with the heritages of Jerusalem arose and became pivotal and central to what was happening. And Yasser Arafat was quoted as saying, "You Jews were never here. This isn't your temple. It's in Nablus or in Saudi Arabia. Look for your holy sites elsewhere." There are very few things that discredited the political process more than Yasser Arafat's denial of the Jewish attachment. It was seen by Israelis, to a certain extent, I think justified, that this was a litmus test as to whether we had any kind of legitimate presence there. And Temple Mount denial has become part of the political culture that has ensued. What happened in Camp David is also very telling. Camp David failed for a number of reasons, but one of the major reasons was the inability to compromise on issues of heritage. There was a deal there, and the deal was, you, Israelis, will waive your claims of sovereignty over Al-Aqsa, the Temple Mount. Your rights exist, your attachment exists, but they will be suspended in the name of a higher good that is arriving at an agreement with the Palestinians. Palestinians, on the other hand, will also waive their heritage, and that is the right of return to their homes. Except for symbolic exception, Palestinians will have the right to return, just as the Jews have right to the Temple Mount. They will suspend their right to return, and there would be a set-off between a Palestinian waiver of the implementation of the right of return, Israeli waiver of control over the Temple Mount, both of them having rights, each suspending them in the name of a higher good. It didn't work. And that was one of the major reasons why Camp David failed. Not surprising, or perhaps ironically, all of this came to a head a month after Camp David, when on September 28, 2000, a heavy-set Israeli politician with a great future in back of him, Ariel Sharon, paid a triumphal visit to Al-Aqsa, the Temple Mount, triggering the Second Intifada. And the Second Intifada, in terms of heritage, is a pivotal event. Second Intifada, basically the outbreak of the Intifada, signified the bankruptcy of political processes, and what has ensued since then is the ascendancy of those who weaponize the past, weaponize heritage, weaponize faith. The events in Jerusalem during these years have been driven by those whose claims to the city are absolute, exclusionary, and often incendiary. Among Jews, it is the Temple Mount movement who have become more powerful and mainstream. Today, official Israel sees the status quo as established by Moshe Dayan as the greatest blunder Israel has made since 1967. It is also those who are displacing settlements in heritage sites in Jerusalem, like Silwan, City of David, and Sheikh Jarrah. Among the Muslims, it is the various iterations of the Muslim Brotherhood, whose claims to Jerusalem are exclusionary, and Hamas is one of the embodiments of that. And then you have the end of days evangelicals who see this as part of the pageant of the rapture and who make the Temple Mount movement and the Muslim Brotherhood look tame. In the years since 2017, we've been saying the forces of radicalization and mutual denial are in ascendancy. They were no longer in ascendancy. You know, the Brotherhood and the Temple Mount movement weren't becoming more powerful. They were power. I can think of no two less pious people in the world than Trump and Netanyahu. Men of faith, they are not. But under their rule, the forces that weaponize the past and heritage became to rule things. They weren't becoming powerful, they were the power. As a result of that, it is fair to say that the war in Gaza has its roots in the trajectory of events in Jerusalem. It fed on it. It is the same phenomenon, and regrettably, it is the abuse of heritage that has led us to the situation in which we find ourselves.
You did a great job of walking us through, I think, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through heritage. Kalliopi, Danny's talking about a conflict that's very much alive today, and we know that, we see that on the TV every day. But you've done a lot of work in the Eastern Mediterranean on difficult heritage as it regards previous conflicts among Muslims and Christians, Greeks and Turks. Your work in Thessaloniki, your focus on the Eastern Mediterranean. Can you walk us through the difficult heritage of the region a little bit and how Greece, how Turkey might have dealt with their difficult heritage and the religious communities that inhabited this region?
Mm-hmm. I would first like to take on Daniel's point of how things change and how a site that was not contested before suddenly becomes contested, and how, in a way, difficult heritage was not always, like what is difficult heritage changes over time. So these sites that we're talking about were not necessarily seen, sometimes they were not seen as heritage of any sort. And this is one of the most, perhaps best examples of this from a different part of the world is the statues that were demolished during the Black Lives Matter demonstrations in 2020. Statues that were there for decades or even centuries, which were fine, they were a source of pride. Because society changed, because times changed, they were suddenly seen as associated with racial injustice. So what is difficult heritage has a lot to do with an encounter and a discussion within society, and has to do with how times change. And coming to Greece, closer here, I would say that there are a couple of sites that are either already recognized as difficult heritage sites, but there are many more in waiting. I'm thinking here, one obvious groups of sites is those associated with state torture or exile during the German occupation, during the Civil War, during the dictatorship. I'm thinking here of sites such as Yaros and Makronissos, which were places of exile. Or sites of torture and execution, such as Haidari or Kesariani, Skouvaftiri of Kesariani, where people were executed, and many more all over Greece. So there are many sites which are either recognized or either they're unilaterally claimed, which is also problematic, like because difficult heritage really requires an inclusive understanding of the history. Or others are left to crumble, others are in danger of unrelated investments, such as Yaros. So we have a full range of sites which, in some cases, have been involve self-reflection and acknowledgement, but in other cases, they don't. And it's important because the civil war and the dictatorship are still echo in political debates today. They're not something of the past so much. Like
not so much like the Ottoman, perhaps.
I wouldn't.
monuments.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
Another very obvious group of sites are those associated with the Holocaust and the extermination of Greek Jews, especially in Thessaloniki, where 96% of the Jewish population, one of the highest percentages in Europe, were exterminated during the Second World War. There are some memorials put in place in various sites, for example, on Eleftheria Square, where 9,000 men were assembled and humiliated for hours, or in the site of Aristotle University, where the Jewish cemetery used to be, and it was demolished during the Second World War. Or at the old railway station, there is also a memorial which relates, because this is the site from where people were deported. But I would say that these sites are often vandalized or they are often invisible. And this points out to the fact that there is still a lot of progress to be made. And as I said before, anti-Semitism and this reluctance to engage with a difficult past is still here, and this means that it's not dead, like it does not belong to the past, like the trauma is not properly healed. And difficult heritage requires to be actively embraced, and it requires expertise and empathy and social engagement and social work. So in the rest of the region, there are also many important sites. I can think of Ulucanlar prison in Turkey is a very famous prison where torture took place during the dictatorship. Madimak in Sivas, where Alevis were burnt alive in the 90s. So there are many difficult sites all over. I can think of more in Mostar and in Albania, but perhaps we should pause here. And
we will go back to Danny, I think, then, to ask about the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in its current form today. And I don't think we can separate the war in Gaza and the chaos that we're seeing inside Israel, within Israeli society, over difficult heritage, from this conversation. So, I mean, Danny, how would you look at the current war in Gaza and the factors driving it, and the way that the Israeli and the Palestinian communities remember or are internalizing the war, perhaps in their own ways, through selective memory? How would you describe that in terms of difficult heritage, and how does it relate? How does that selective memory of the conflict, where we have Palestinians who are focusing obviously on the horrors in Gaza, we have an Israeli society that's focusing on the bloodshed of 7 October. How does that fit in with difficult heritage?
Well, I think the general context is that Israeli society and Palestinian society have each in their own ways have undergone a near-death experience. Israelis, and I include myself, have found it extremely difficult to understand or to visualize the carnage that we have inflicted on innocent men, women, and children in Gaza. I don't think I'm insensitive to Palestinian issues, but it took me quite some time to come to believe that, because it was difficult to believe that this is what has become of us. And only now is Israel society beginning in some way to understand what is it that we have done. Similarly, it is common among Palestinians to deny that the savagery of October 7th and the slaughter took place. There's denial of that. There's an inherent inability to identify with the pain of the other side and the formative experiences of the other side. I moved to Israel as a young man more than 50 years ago. The Nakba didn't exist. It never happened. We denied it. And so the formative experience of modern Palestinian consciousness is something that we have denied. And we have been in the grips of a frenzy of mutual denial, and it's very commonplace today. War crimes? What war crimes? We're the victim. October 7th? Well, it didn't happen, and if it did, you had it coming. Look at what you've been doing for us for all of these times. And the way forward will require somehow the ability to recognize the legitimacy, not the truth, but the legitimacy of the narrative of the other, the presence of the other. Jews we pride ourselves in remembering. It's because we remembered that we had returned after thousands of years to the land of Israel. But when we identify that same trait of devotion and memory of Palestinians who sumud, who hold on tight, who are not going anywhere and are celebrating their own memory, it terrifies us. Yeah. So the narratives of one impose terror on each other, and we have to find ways of dealing with that.
Maybe just we have a few minutes left. Oh.
One last one. This was summed up best by a friend, Hussam Zumlad, who was the PLO ambassador in Washington and now in London. And he said, when we Palestinians will have sovereignty over Jerusalem, we will not only recognize the Jewish attachment, we will celebrate it. Mm. He received death threats. Wow. Not from Israelis.
Yeah. I think that gets into the issue of remembrance, and a big part of that is preservation, right, Kalliopi? And I mean, when we talk about, you mentioned the Nakba. I mean, I know Palestinians, there's a huge effort to remember, right, that being driven out of your homes, right? Palestinians hold on to the keys of their homes, or the keys of their ancestors, of the house that they locked up in Nablus or Jerusalem. And that's really preservation, right? That's a form of how you preserve it. How does preservation fit with difficult heritage? And what are the kind of the questions that you have around it?
It's a good question. Difficult heritage sites have a lot to do with evidence and with overcoming denial, what exactly you said. And often there are important dilemmas between experts, between preserving and explaining, or preserving the evidence, the original evidence, and explaining or even honoring the victims. I'm thinking here, one of the most notorious examples are the debates, very fascinating debates, theoretical debates that have been taking place in the preservation of Auschwitz, where the retreating, the outgoing Nazi troops tried to blow up the gas chambers in order not to leave any evidence. And then the work of the preservation team was to preserve the ruin. In one of the cases where they actually restored one of the gas chambers, they were immediately accused by Holocaust deniers that, this is fake. So any preservation action you take in such a site has a huge responsibility behind it. Anything you touch or you don't touch is a decision which has to be really, really thought over. In other cases, for example, the other most moving and most difficult dilemma in Auschwitz was the hair of victims, which has been preserved, and it's presented behind the glass. And there were many people that said that, this is the body parts of the victims. They deserve to be put to rest. They deserve to be buried. It's not in their honor. They cannot be sacrificed forever. This is a perpetual sacrifice for the for the service of evidence and for the service of memory, but it is against the honor of the victims themselves. So these types of dilemmas are very, very present in difficult heritage sites, and I feel that in a post-truth era, the importance of evidence at the end of the day becomes more heavy than paying honor and putting the victims to rest. And it's a sacrifice that it's a perpetual sacrifice of the victims for us, for a larger good.
And we are just out of time, but I would like to end on a positive note. Maybe if we could jump back to Danny in Jerusalem. Do you see any positive signs of how difficult heritage can be preserved when you look at the neighborhoods around Jerusalem and the way communities interact with heritage sites. Are there any silver linings potentially for the future? If you could keep it brief, because we've got a very short time.
There are hidden webs or veins and arteries beneath the surface that connect Israelis and Palestinians. Under occupation and under the weaponization of heritage, these are not often seen, but they're there. Jerusalem is a city that has two peoples, and neither are going anywhere, and three faiths. In the 1 square kilometer of the old city, you have the place where the tectonic plates of the Arab world and the West, Jerusalem, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, meet in a very limited physical space. Jerusalem knows how to contain that. It's not touchy-feely, it's not fuzzy-warm, but Jerusalem knows how to speak in multiple voices. It is when we turn the keys or the driving forces of this conflict over to the exclusionary pyromaniacs, that is when Jerusalem becomes one of the most dangerous places on the planet.
Yeah. Thank you both. I think it was a fascinating conversation.
Thank you.